listening to Radio Pinko Storytime.
What God looks like. Once I was visiting my cousin. She was about 7 years old at the time. She lives in one of those cities in southern Ontario that were once towns unto themselves, but today are linked by long amoebic strands all the way back into Toronto. My cousin lives with her mum and dad and cats in a bungalow with carpeted floors. My cousin has one of those names that are presidential and seem ill-fitted for a small child, like an overlong tweed jacket from the rack of a frippery on Saint Laurent. My cousin has blonde hair and coloring books of princesses and shoes that light up when she walks in them. Every year her parents take her to Canada's Wonderland, and sometimes I go with them. My cousin will sparkle with excitement until she grows nauseous because of roller coasters, pasta salad, and hot sun. In all of these ways, my cousin is an ordinary person, but she is also my cousin, and therefore to me she is not ordinary at all. When I see my cousin, I try to get her to let me read her a story, or even better, I try to get her to read me a story. In her room, she has many books with large print and sturdy covers and eye-watering illustrations. There are also a few novels by Roald Dahl, which I foist on her every Christmas. She owns a small collection of illustrated Bible stories, too. It bothers me to see my cousin keeping a stack of Bible stories with pictures of rosy-cheeked Christ children in her room. And I admit it, I grew up reading illustrated Bible stories just like her, but that's exactly why I'm against it. I know how bad these stories are for you. They left me with a childhood obsession of angels and devils and the freaksome veneration of divine power, a God, that's capital G, God, that squats up in heaven with his, capital H, his holy thumb over creation, to squash like an ant what he will. So it is only with reluctance that I read to her about Jacob wrestling with the angel on the banks of a river, or God turning Edith, the wife of Lot, into a pillar of salt, after the good Lord hath set Sodom and Gomorrah on fire. After reading to my cousin about how God had appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush, she asked me what that meant exactly. Because I am not good at explaining things, I told her that God had appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush. Rather unsatisfied, she asked me if that was how God always looked. I told her there was still a lot of debate about that. I asked her what she thought God looked like, and she told me that if she knew that, then she wouldn't be asking me. I told her that everyone has a different idea of how God looks. Some people think God looks like an old man with large muscles and flowing white hair and a white robe. Other people think God doesn't look human at all. One of my friends told me that they think God looks like a huge tangle of light, like a ball of glowing yarn whose strings embrace the entire universe. But, I told my cousin, I don't believe in God. But if I did, I would know exactly what God would look like. God doesn't look that different from us, with arms and legs and a head with eyes and ears and a mouth and nose. God is of course tremendously old, so old that they aren't even old anymore. God is certainly not good looking. God wears a blue jumpsuit and sturdy boots. Sometimes God wears yellow rubber gloves and always keeps a greasy rag in their back pocket. God spends most of their time in a huge boiler room, deep in the viscera of the cosmos. The boiler room is full of huge metal tubs and tanks, thick pipes, and roaring furnaces. Everywhere there are levers and dials and gauges and valves. The boiler room is not heaven. God has not been to heaven for hundreds of years. Heaven is on a windowsill covered in plants in a loft in Pointe Saint-Charles that used to be a cannery on the south side of the canal. The boiler room is where God works, and God has to work very hard. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning of things, when God was still a kid and didn't have many responsibilities, God was able to wander around while their older relatives, Baal, Moloch, Ra, Prometheus, and many, many others, were busy governing the universe like they had since always. God wandered the earth, looking around, meeting new people, and befriending them. While Ra was flooding the rivers, while Baal was blowing the winds, and Thor was rolling the thunder clouds over the earth, God stayed on the ground, helping people with their problems. Where God met the hungry, God produced food out of thin air and fed them. Where God met the sick, they healed them. Where God found disagreements, they listened to the people who were arguing and gave everyone everything what they wanted. When God found cruelty, God punished the wicked with storms, wars, locusts, anything God could think of. God could do anything for anyone, and they did. One day, God was called for a meeting up in heaven. All of the deities were there, especially the old ones, Baal and Moloch, Thor and Freya, Kronos and Hera, and many others. They told God that they had been working for eons, keeping all of existence running in careful balance, and now they were very tired. Today, the old gods were going to go into retirement. They told God that now, God was in charge of the universe. Well, not just God, of course. All of the younger generation was going to step up now and take care of creation. God was very excited. The first thing God did was to make heaven nicer, to renovate all of its houses, repave all of its roads, plant new gardens, so that all of the old gods would be able to enjoy their retirement better. God was young and talented and full of energy, and to do all of this was nothing to them. The other young gods asked if they could help, but God politely said no. God was just fine and could do it all by themselves, and that the other gods should just enjoy the nice new heaven that God had built for them. After heaven, God went down to the earth. God did what they always did and helped people. God cured disease and fed the hungry and clothed and sheltered the poor. Wherever God went, people asked God for favors, and God made them promises. And God always kept their promises. The only trouble was that since all the old gods had retired, there was a lot of work to do, and more people seemed to be asking God for help. The farmers of one valley depended on the flood of the river every year, so God made the river flood and replenish the soil. But then, down in the town by the banks of the river, there were many people who lost their homes in the flood, and they cried out to God for help. So God stopped the flood. But once they did, the farmers became angry because they needed the flood for a good harvest. So God went down to the sea and raised a new, beautiful island out of the water, and God told the people who lived in the town by the river that they could now live on the island, far away from the flood, and that God would personally build them a newer, much nicer town to live in. But no sooner had God promised them that than the fisher folk complained that God turned the sea that they had once fished in into dry land. And so God made the fisher folk find spears and bows, arrows, and God told them they could hunt the many wild animals who lived in the nearby forest. But the very next day, the animals were wailing to God that their once peaceful homes were now full of fierce hunters who were killing and eating them. So God thought about it, and gave all of the hunters terrible cramps in their feet, so they could not run through the forest very quickly. Even still, God could still hear the moans and the howls of the hunters, and on it went. Whenever God solved a problem for some people, it seemed like twice as many new people became angry. But even still, more and more people came to God asking for their help, and God could not say no. Mothers came to God with sick children in their arms. God, of course, cured every single child brought to them. But God also knew it was taking a long time because there were hundreds of people asking God for healing every day. And so God cleverly decided to get rid of illness altogether. God rinsed all sickness out of the world. But still people came to God, petitioning them. What about all of the people who had died before God had gotten rid of disease? What about those beloved friends and family who had died anyway, not from illness but simply old age? What about their pain? So God went further yet. God decreed that not only would there be no more sickness, but there would simply be no more death. Well, you can imagine what happened then. The earth was soon desperately crowded with people, all of the people who had ever lived, which even then was quite a few. Many of these people were too old and decrepit to farm or do any other work, and soon food was quite scarce. And while no one died anymore, there were still hundreds of babies born every day, and their wailing filled up the air, and the earth was filled up with humanity. People lamented that there was no peace and quiet anymore, and that the whole world had become squalid, and there was no time and no place to rest anymore. So God thought about this, and they decided that for as long as there would be no one dying, there could be no new children born. And so there were no more babies. But of course, once God had decided that there would be no more infants, the people complained to God that they wanted to start their own families, that the world would soon have nothing except old people, and that the joy and vigor and color of the young would be lost. God threw up their hands and allowed for there to be babies born again, though they doubted the idea even as they spoke it. One day, God was visited by a small group of people, and already God was nervous, because God knew that they probably would want something, and God wouldn't be able to turn them down, and who knew where all that might lead. But the leader of this little group said God should not worry, because they did not want God's help. Rather, they wanted to help God, to ease God's trouble, and assist their fellow humans. All they needed from God was knowledge. The group wanted to know as much as God knew, every detail of the universe, past, present, and future, so that they would have the wisdom to do the right thing. Well, God thought this was a very good idea, so God blessed everyone in the group with their infinite knowledge of the past and the present and the future. Brimming with the wisdom of the cosmos, the small group went away, excited to change the world. God didn't see them again until about a year had passed, and the small group was even smaller, since some of them had just given up. Those who remained were frustrated. They knew the truth, of course. They knew the difference between everything that was just and everything that was unjust. They knew how the people should share the land, how parents should raise their children, how everyone ought to live their lives. But when this enlightened band traveled the world, nobody would listen to them or believe them. "It's no use," the small group of wise people cried out to God. "It's no use knowing what to do if no one will do what we say." God decided the only thing to do now was to give everyone on earth the total and perfect knowledge that they possessed. When everyone knew what was right and what was wrong, there would be no more fighting. So one night, God gave to all living beings supreme and complete understanding. When they awoke, everyone would know everything, and then people would be able to solve their problems. But the very next day, God saw that across the world, there were fights and arguments. With perfect knowledge of the past and the present, people everywhere remembered with perfect clarity every cruelty they had ever visited upon one another. The transgressions of millions of people over thousands of years was fresh and sore in everyone's mind. And moreover, with perfect knowledge of the future, the people despaired as they looked forwards in horror, as they anticipated everything they and their loved ones would suffer. God did not know what to do. Everyone who came to them with a terrible problem was surely right, but everything God did was somehow wrong. And God had so much work. Besides all of the people and animals, and sometimes even the plants and tiny fungi who were not satisfied, there were endless chores. Every day the sun had to go up and come down, and the moon had to take its place. God had to push and pull out the tides twice every day. God had to light and extinguish trillions of stars every dusk, every dawn. God had to sprinkle snow on the mountaintops and pour rain over the land every spring and guide the trees upwards so that they would grow straight. God even had to open and close the flowers and blow the winds, the balmy chinooks, cool breezes, the harsh blizzards. The harder God worked, the less people liked God. Yet still, there were more and more people asking for help. God began to visit the earth less and less. Instead, God began to work at a distance. God flew below the earth and placed their hands on it, and began to spin it around, faster and faster. God pushed the earth away as hard as they could, and the earth began to fly around the sun, turning as it did. God fanned the air so that the wind would never cease, chasing itself all over the earth. God churned up the oceans and gave the water a current, so that it would never stop wanting to move. God whispered into every ear, and every heart, and every cell, a thing called want. God whispered to them to seek sustenance, and knowledge, and love. As God pushed the earth away into the dark, bruised ocean of space, God whispered away everything they had said before, undoing all they had done, every favor, every promise, every time they tried to help. God hoped that everything would take care of everything else. If that didn't work, maybe everything would take care of itself. God knew that there would be more sadness than ever, that the world would still be full of fear and violence and stupidity. There would still be fighting and sickness and death. But God did not have a better idea. God made one more thing. God made a boiler room deep in the viscera of the cosmos. God filled it with tanks and pipes and valves and switches and dials and gauges. God used these to keep watch over everything in the universe, from the direction of the wind in Tokyo to the temperature of the surface of Venus. Deep in the boiler room, God would make small adjustments, still would make a few tweaks here and there to keep the balance of things. God was and still is curious about the earth, but God doesn't come here very often. That said, I tell my cousin, if you saw God today, you might not recognize them, for God is certainly not good looking. God wears a blue jumpsuit and sturdy boots. Sometimes God wears yellow rubber gloves and always keeps a greasy rag in their back pocket. The boiler room is where God works. God has to work very hard. God looks like someone who works very hard. Good morning, this is Simon Bandrov. It is the 22nd of May, 2016, and I hope you enjoyed this story, What God Looks Like. I just want to acknowledge that the music in this episode came from Ivan Volkov, Disparition, and from my good friend Wesley Collett Taylor, whose piece, Footnote to Howl, you heard at the beginning and at the end of the story.